In the forgotten corners of Montana, where broken dreams gather dust like tumbleweeds, sometimes the most unexpected purchases change everything. Sadie Mae Carver never imagined that bidding on a weathered cowboy at Willow Ridge's desperate work-for-shelter auction would transform her life. She was just a pregnant widow trying to save her crumbling ranch, willing to gamble her last dollars on anyone strong enough to mend fences and fix what time had broken. Colt Avery seemed like damaged goods, another war-scarred drifter with haunted eyes and calloused hands. But beneath his quiet exterior lay a heart that had been waiting for something worth fighting for. As autumn painted the valley gold and her baby's arrival drew near, Sadie would discover that sometimes God answers prayers in the most unexpected packages. But would the secrets they both carried destroy their fragile chance at happiness before love could take root? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Willow Ridge Valley like a gentle blessing, softening the harsh edges of drought-cracked earth and weathered fence posts. Sadie Mae Carver stood on the wraparound porch of her late husband's ranch house, one hand resting on the small of her aching back, the other cradling the pronounced curve of her belly where their child grew restless in the dawn light. 7 months along, and she could feel every one of those weeks in the way her body had changed, adapted, prepared for a future she'd never imagined facing alone. The old rocking chair behind her creaked in the morning breeze, its familiar sound both comforting and melancholy. Thomas had carved that chair from Montana pine during their first winter together, his large hands working the wood with the same gentle patience he'd shown her when teaching her to ride, to brand cattle, to see this land through the eyes of someone born to it. Now it sat empty, a testament to dreams interrupted and promises left unfulfilled. She shifted her weight, feeling the baby kick against her ribs, and gazed out over the property that had been in the Carver family for 3 generations. The main house, with its peeling white paint and sagging shutters, stood like a tired sentinel watching over acres of neglected pasture. Fence lines that once ran straight and true now sagged between rotting posts, creating gaps where cattle. I could wonder if she'd had any cattle left to worry about. The barn's red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and half the roof tiles lay scattered in the tall grass, victims of last spring's hailstorm that she couldn't afford to repair. Thomas had been gone 8 months now, taken by a heart attack that came without warning while he was fixing the water pump down by the creek. 8 months of trying to hold together what 3 generations of Carver men had built with their bare hands and stubborn determination. 8 months of watching creditors circle like vultures, each visit bringing another stack of papers, another deadline, another threat to take away the only home she'd ever known. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, and Sadie placed both hands on her belly, speaking in the soft voice she'd taken to using when the child grew restless. No, little one. You're getting mighty crowded in there, aren't you? Won't be much longer now. The doctor in town had said early October, which gave her perhaps 6 weeks to figure out how a woman alone with a newborn could possibly manage a 1,000-acre ranch that was already falling apart under her inadequate care. Behind her, the screen door squeaked open, and Martha Henley's familiar voice called out with the kind of cheerful determination that only a lifelong friend could muster in the face of obvious despair. Sadie Mae, you get yourself back in here and finish your breakfast. That baby needs proper nourishment, and standing out there worrying about things you can't change isn't helping anybody. Martha had been Thomas's aunt, though she was barely 10 years older than Sadie herself, having been the youngest of the Carver siblings by a considerable margin. She'd moved in the day after the funeral without being asked, appearing at the door with her suitcases and a casserole that had lasted 3 days. That was 8 months ago, and Martha showed no signs of leaving, for which Sadie was more grateful than she could express. I'm coming, Sadie called back, taking one last look at the valley that spread before her like a painting done in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere out there, beyond the rolling hills, where the morning mist was already beginning to lift, lay the town of Willow Ridge and the weekly work-for-shelter auction that represented her last, desperate hope. Inside, the kitchen still smelled like the biscuits Martha had pulled from the oven an hour ago, though they sat cooling now beside a jar of blackberry preserves that Martha had made from berries growing wild along the creek. The kitchen had always been the heart of the house, its wide plank floors worn smooth by generations of boots, its cabinets built by Thomas's grandfather from local timber. Sunlight streamed through the large windows that looked out over the vegetable garden, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the warm air. Martha stood at the stove, her grey hair pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn for as long as Sadie had known her apron tied around a waist that had thickened with age, but still moved with the efficiency of a woman who'd spent her life taking care of others. She turned as Sadie entered, her blue eyes sharp with the kind of concern that came from watching someone you love struggle against impossible odds. "Sit," Martha commanded, pointing to the chair at the head of the table where Thomas used to sit, the one with the view of both the front yard and the pasture beyond. "And don't give me any arguments about not being hungry. That child needs protein, and you need to keep your strength up for what's coming." Sadie lowered herself carefully into the chair, accepting the plate of scrambled eggs and bacon that Martha set before her. The food was perfectly prepared, as always, but it might as well have been sawdust for all the appetite she could muster. Still, she dutifully took a bite, knowing that Martha would stand over her until she'd eaten every morsel. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Martha began, settling into her own chair with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she fussed over Sadie's breakfast. "About the auction." The auction. The words hung in the air between them like a confession of failure. Every Saturday, the town held what they euphemistically called a work-for-shelter auction, though everyone knew it was really a place where desperate people sold their labor to anyone willing to provide room and board. Men mostly, though occasionally women appeared on the auction block, all of them carrying the hollow-eyed look of those who'd run out of options. "I know what you're thinking," Sadie said, pushing eggs around her plate without really eating them, "that it's crazy for a pregnant woman to take on a stranger, especially one desperate enough to be selling himself for room and board." Martha's weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she studied Sadie with the kind of frank assessment that came from 60 years of watching people make both wise decisions and foolish ones. "What I'm thinking is that you're too proud for your own good, and too stubborn to ask for help when you need it most. But I'm also thinking that you're smart enough to know the difference between taking a calculated risk and throwing yourself off a cliff. The bank's given me until the end of October," Sadie said quietly, the words coming out like a prayer or a curse. "If I can't make the payment by then, they'll foreclose. I owe them $18,000, Martha. 18,000. I don't have $18, much less 18,000. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible mathematics. Martha had sold her own small place in town to help with the funeral expenses and the most pressing debts. But it had been like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The money had disappeared into the endless maw of late fees, penalties, and accumulated interest that had built up during Thomas's final illness when medical bills had taken precedence over everything else. "How much could you afford to pay someone?" Martha asked finally, her practical nature always looking for solutions rather than dwelling on problems. Sadie set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, one hand automatically moving to her belly, where the baby had settled into a more comfortable position. "I've got maybe $300 left in the checking account. The pantry's full enough to last through winter if we're careful, and there's the house and barn for shelter. It's not much, but it's something. It's more than some of those men have seen in months," Martha pointed out. "And if you found the right person, someone with experience in ranch work, you might be able to get the place in good enough shape to attract a buyer." Even if you can't save it, you could at least walk away with something instead of losing everything. The idea of selling the ranch was like a knife in Sadie's chest, but she'd already accepted that keeping it might be impossible. The question was whether she could find a way to hold on long enough to give birth, recover, and make some kind of plan for the future. A good ranch hand could repair the worst of the damage, maybe get the fences in shape and the barn roof patched. Before winter set in, it wouldn't save the ranch, but it might make the difference between losing everything and salvaging enough to start over somewhere else. I suppose I could offer room, board, and $50 a month, Sadie said slowly, working through the numbers in her head. More if we could get some of the cattle back and actually turn a profit, but that's probably wishful thinking at this point. Martha nodded approvingly. That's fair wages for a man who needs a roof over his head, and you'd be doing him as much of a favor as he'd be doing you. Some of those fellows at the auction are good men who've just had a run of bad luck. Veterans mostly, men who came back from the war and couldn't find their place in a world that had moved on without them, the war. It seemed like everything came back to that these days. Thomas had been too old to serve, but plenty of younger men from the valley had gone off to fight in places with names that Sadie could barely pronounce. Some had come back changed, struggling to readjust to civilian life, finding that the skills that had kept them alive in combat didn't translate easily to peacetime employment. Others hadn't come back at all, leaving behind wives and children, and parents who would never stop waiting for news that would never come. There's a difference between taking a chance on someone and being foolish about it, Sadie said, more to herself than to Martha. I'd need to be careful, especially with the baby coming. Of course you would. That's why you'd interview them first. Check references if they have any. Use your common sense. You've got good instincts about people, Sadie May. You always have. Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere in the tall grass, its song clear and sweet in the morning air. It was the sound of home, of all the mornings she'd spent in this house with Thomas, planning their days and their future, talking about the children they hoped to have and the legacy they wanted to leave. Now Thomas was gone. Their future had become her uncertain present, and the legacy was slipping away one unpaid bill at a time. But the meadowlark was still singing, and the baby was still growing strong beneath her heart. And somewhere in town, there might be a man desperate enough to work for almost nothing who could help her hold on to what remained of her world just a little longer. The auction's tomorrow, Martha said gently. If you're going to do this, we should probably get ready. Sadie nodded slowly, her decision crystallizing with the kind of clarity that came from having no other choice. I suppose we should. The Saturday morning air in Willow Ridge carried the scent of dust and desperation, mingling with the aroma of coffee and fried bacon from the diner across from the courthouse square. Sadie May sat in Martha's old Ford pickup, her hands folded over, her belly watching the crowd gather around the makeshift platform that served as the town's auction block. It wasn't much to look at. Just a few wooden planks raised about 3 feet off the ground, but it had been the site of countless transactions over the years, from livestock sales to farm equipment auctions to these newer, more troubling gatherings, where human dignity was bartered for survival. The men waiting to be auctioned stood in a loose group near the platform, each carrying whatever possessions they owned in worn duffel bags or cardboard suitcases held together with rope. Some were young, barely out of their teens, with the hollow-eyed look of boys who'd grown up too fast in a world that had no use for them. Others showed the grey-touched temples and weathered faces of middle age, men who'd once had steady jobs and respectable lives before circumstance stripped away everything they'd worked to build. "You don't have to do this," Martha said quietly from the driver's seat, her voice carrying the kind of gentle concern that made it clear she'd support whatever decisions Sadie made. "We could turn around right now, go home, and figure out something else." But they both knew there was nothing else to figure out. The bank payment loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon, and time was running out faster than water through a broken dam. Sadie pressed her palm against the window, feeling the cool glass against her skin, and studied the faces of the men who stood waiting to sell themselves to whoever had the cash to buy their labor. That's when she saw him. He stood apart from the others, not in any obvious way that might draw attention, but with the subtle positioning of someone accustomed to observing rather than being observed. Where the other men fidgeted with nervous energy or stared at the ground in defeat, this one remained perfectly still, his grey eyes scanning the crowd with the kind of calm assessment that spoke of discipline learned in harder places than a small Montana town. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the lean build of a man who'd known both physical labor and periods of not having enough to eat. His dark hair was cut short, military style, though it had grown out enough to lose the razor-sharp precision of active duty. A thick moustache framed a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, and his hands, hanging loose at his sides, bore the calluses and small scars that marked a man who worked with tools and wasn't afraid of honest labor. But it was his eyes that caught and held Sadie's attention. They were the color of storm clouds, grey-green and distant, carrying depths that hinted at experiences most people couldn't imagine. There was pain there, carefully controlled and deeply buried, but also something else, a fundamental decency that hadn't been destroyed by whatever circumstances had brought him to this place. "That one," she said softly, nodding toward the tall stranger, "the one standing by himself." Martha followed her gaze and studied the man for a long moment before nodding slowly. "He looks capable enough. Military bearing, I'd say. Probably served overseas." The auctioneer, a portly man named Bill Hutchins, who usually handled livestock sales, climbed onto the platform and began calling for attention. His voice carried easily across the square, practiced and professional, despite the unsavory nature of this particular auction. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got 15 good men looking for honest work today. Room, board, and whatever wages you can manage in exchange for labor. Let's start with young Jimmy Morrison here." The auction proceeded with the kind of efficient brutality that came from necessity rather than cruelty. Men were called forward, their skills and experience recited like livestock pedigrees, and bids were shouted from the crowd of farmers and ranchers who needed help but couldn't afford to pay regular wages. Some went for as much as $200 a month plus room and board, others for less than half that amount. Sadie watched it all with growing unease, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake by participating in something that felt uncomfortably close to human trafficking, even though she knew these men had chosen to be here. They needed work, and she needed help. It was a transaction born of mutual desperation rather than exploitation, but that knowledge didn't make it feel any less wrong. When the tall stranger was finally called forward, the auctioneer consulted a piece of paper before speaking. "Next up we have Colt Avery, 32 years old, served 2 tours in the Pacific Theater, experienced with livestock, mechanical repair, and general ranch work. References available upon request." Colt stepped onto the platform with the same quiet composure he'd shown while waiting, his eyes sweeping the crowd without appearing to focus on anyone in particular. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't make any effort to sell himself beyond simply standing there with the kind of solid presence that suggested reliability. "We'll start the bidding at $100 a month plus room and board," Hutchins announced. A few hands went up, tentative at first, then with more confidence as ranchers recognized quality when they saw it. The price climbed steadily, $120, $150, $175. Sadie felt her heart sink as the numbers rose beyond what she could afford. She had known this might happen, that the best men would command prices she couldn't match, but she'd hoped against hope that she might find someone both capable and affordable. At $200, most of the bidding dropped away, leaving only 2 ranchers competing for Colt services. One was Jake Patterson, who owned the largest spread in the valley and had a reputation for working his men hard, but treating them fairly. The other was a man Sadie didn't recognize, though his expensive hat and confident manner suggested he had money to spend. $225, Patterson called out. 250, countered the stranger. 275. 300. The bidding stalled there, the silence stretching as Patterson weighed his options. $300 was serious money, enough to hire two less experienced men instead of one skilled one. After a moment, that felt like an eternity, Patterson shook his head and stepped back. Going once at 300, Hutchins called. Going twice. $50, Sadie said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly across the square. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the whistle of wind through the cottonwood, trees and the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyards at the edge of town. Every head turned toward her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how foolish she must sound. Offering $50 when the bidding had reached 300. Hutchins cleared his throat, clearly confused. Ma'am, I think you might have misheard. The current bid is $300. I heard correctly, Sadie said, forcing herself to stand despite the awkwardness of maneuvering her pregnant body out of the truck. I'm offering $50 a month, plus room and board, plus a percentage of any profits if we can get the ranch operating in the black. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some amused, others sympathetic. The well-dressed stranger who'd been bidding against Patterson looked her up and down with obvious disdain before turning away dismissively. But on the platform, Colt Avery's storm-grey eyes found hers and held them, and for a moment that stretched like sunlight across water, she felt as though he was seeing straight through to her soul. Ma'am, Hutchins said gently, that's a mighty fine offer, but this gentleman here has bid $300 cash money. And what happens when his work is done? Sadie asked, still looking at Colt rather than the auctioneer. Where does he go then? I'm offering steady work through the winter, a chance to be part of something instead of just hired muscle. The stranger snorted and waved his hand dismissively. 325, and let's be done with this nonsense. But Colt spoke for the first time since stepping onto the platform, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen. I'll take the lady's offer. The crowd erupted in surprised chatter, but Hutchins banged his gavel for order. Now hold on there, Colt. You can't just choose your employer. This is an auction, and the high bidder can go to hell, Colt said mildly, stepping down from the platform. I came here to find work, not to be sold to the highest bidder like a prize bull. The lady made me an offer I can live with, and I'm accepting it. The well-dressed stranger's face flushed red with anger. You can't do that. I bid fair and square. You bid for a commodity, Colt replied, slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder. I'm a man, not livestock, and I choose where I work. Without another word, he walked across the square toward Sadie, his eyes never leaving hers. As he approached, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, the set of his shoulders that suggested burdens carried alone for too long. But she could also see something else, something that looked almost like relief. Ma'am, he said when he reached her, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that belonged to an earlier, more courteous age. Colt Avery, I believe we have a deal. Sadie found herself looking up at him, noting the way his presence seemed to create a zone of calm in the chaos of the auction square. Sadie May Carver, and yes, Mr. Avery, I believe we do. The ride back to the ranch passed in companionable silence, with Colt sitting in the truck bed at his own insistence, his duffel bag beside him and his eyes taking in the landscape with the kind of careful attention that spoke of ingrained habit. Sadie found herself stealing glances at him through the rear window, noting how he seemed to catalogue every fence line, every building, every potential problem or opportunity they passed. When they pulled into the ranch yard, Colt was out of the truck almost before Martha had brought it to a complete stop, his movements economical and purposeful. He stood for a moment surveying the property, his hands resting loosely on his hips, his expression unreadable. Sadie watched him take in the sagging barn roof, the broken fence rails, the overgrown pastures where cattle should have been grazing, and felt a familiar stab of shame at how far the place had fallen. It's not much to look at right now, she said, climbing down from the cab with Martha's steadying hand on her elbow. But it used to be something special. Could be again with the right care. Colt nodded slowly, his gaze moving from the house to the outbuildings and back again. Good bones, he said finally. Foundations solid, frames true. Rest is just maintenance that's been deferred too long. There was no judgment in his voice, just the kind of practical assessment that came from a man who understood that sometimes survival meant letting things slide that shouldn't slide. Sadie felt some of the tension leave her shoulders at his matter-of-fact acceptance of the situation. Martha will show you to the bunkhouse, she said. It's not fancy, but it's clean and dry. Meals are at 7, noon and 6, though if you're working late, we can arrange something else. Appreciate it, Mum. He picked up his duffel bag and followed Martha toward the small building that had once housed seasonal workers, back when the ranch employed them. I'll get settled and then take a proper look around. If that suits you. That suits me fine. An hour later, Sadie was sitting on the front porch when Colt emerged from the bunkhouse carrying a leather tool roll that had seen better days but was obviously well maintained. He'd changed into work clothes, dungarees and a flannel shirt that had been mended in several places but was clean and serviceable. His boots were good leather, broken in but not worn out, the kind that would last for years with proper care. Mind, if I ask what your most pressing concern is, he said, settling his hat on his head and looking up at her with those steady grey eyes. Sadie considered the question, trying to prioritize among a dozen urgent problems. Water pumps been acting up, and winter's coming. If we lose water to the house and barn, we're in real trouble. Colt nodded and headed toward the creek without another word. Sadie watched him go, noting the way he moved across the uneven ground. With the sure-footed confidence of someone accustomed to rough terrain, he walked like a soldier, she realized, with that particular combination of alertness and efficiency that marked men who'd learned to be ready for anything. From her position on the porch, she could see him examining the pump housing, his hands moving with practiced skill as he traced pipes and checked connections. After about 10 minutes, he disappeared into the barn and emerged with a wrench and what looked like spare parts that Thomas had stored for repairs that never got made. The baby kicked suddenly, a sharp jab that made Sadie gasp and press her hand to her side. The child had been restless all morning, as if sensing the changes happening around them. She rubbed the spot where tiny feet had connected with her ribs and murmured soft words of comfort, though she wasn't sure if they were for the baby or herself. You picked a good one, Martha said, stepping out onto the porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea. He's been down there for an hour, and I can already hear the difference in how that pump sounds. Sadie accepted the tea gratefully, noting that Martha was right. The labored wheeze that had characterized the pump for months had been replaced by a steady, rhythmic thrumming that spoke of machinery working the way it was supposed to work. He seems to know what he's doing. More than that, he works like a man who takes pride in doing things right the first time. That's rarer than you might think these days. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Colt work. He moved with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was completely absorbed in the task at hand, oblivious to everything else. When he finally emerged from behind the pump house, his shirt was stained with grease and his hands were dirty, but there was something almost like satisfaction in his expression. He walked back toward the house with that same measured stride, pausing at the bottom of the porch steps to look up at them. Pump's working proper now, had a loose coupling and a clogged intake screen. Should give you good service through winter if you keep the housing clear of debris. Thank you, Sadie said, and meant it. The relief of having one major problem solved was almost overwhelming in its intensity. What do I owe you for the parts? Nothing. They were already here, just needed installing. He glanced around the yard, his eyes cataloguing other projects that needed attention. If it's all right with you, I'd like to tackle the barn roof next. Weather report says rain coming midweek, and those holes will only get bigger if they're not patched. Of course, whatever you think is most important, He nodded and started to turn away, then paused as if remembering something. Reaching into his shirt pocket, he pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been handled many times. "Found this when I was cleaning out my gear. Thought you might want to see it." Sadie took the paper with curiosity, unfolding it carefully. It was a photograph, faded and creased, but still clear enough to make out the details. It showed a young man in military uniform standing beside a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. Between them was a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. The family looked happy, caught in one of those perfect moments that photographers sometimes manage to capture. The young man in the photograph was unmistakably Colt, though he looked years younger, and infinitely happier than the man who now stood before her. There was light in his eyes that was missing now, an easy smile that suggested he'd once been comfortable with joy. "Your family?" Sadie asked gently, though she already knew the answer from the way his expression had shuttered the moment she'd unfolded the photograph. "Was." The single word carried depths of pain that made Sadie's heart ache in sympathy. "Automobile accident 3 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light in San Francisco." The stark simplicity of the statement somehow made it more devastating than any elaborate explanation could have been. Sadie found herself looking again at the little girl's bright smile, thinking of her own child growing beneath her heart, and felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Colt reached for the photograph, and she handed it back without a word. He folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Anyway," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "thought you should know who you hired. Some folks don't like having bad luck around." "Bad luck?" Sadie repeated, surprised by the bitterness in his voice. "Mr. Avery, losing the people you love isn't bad luck. It's tragedy, and it's terrible. But it doesn't make you cursed or dangerous or whatever it is you think it makes you." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe just the faintest glimmer of hope. But it was gone so quickly that Sadie might have imagined it. "I'll get started on that roof," he said simply, and walked away toward the barn, where ladders and tools waited for someone strong enough to use them. 2 weeks into September, the first hint of autumn touched the valley with cool mornings and the distant promise of changing leaves. Colt had fallen into a routine that seemed to flow naturally from sunrise to sunset, his days structured around the endless list of repairs and improvements that the ranch required. He worked with the kind of steady persistence that got things done without fanfare, appearing each morning at dawn and disappearing into the bunkhouse each evening after supper. Sadie had grown accustomed to the sound of his hammer, the whine of his saw, the steady rhythm of productive labor that had been missing from the ranch for too long. The barn roof was whole again, the water pump hummed contentedly, and 6 smaller projects had been completed with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine craftsmanship. But it was the morning she found him sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread before him that she realized there was more to Colt Avery than simple ranch work. "Morning," she said, pausing in the doorway with one hand pressed to her lower back where a persistent ache had taken up residence. The baby seemed to grow heavier by the day, and simple movements that had once been automatic now required careful consideration. "Morning, ma'am." Colt started to rise, but she waved him back down with a gesture that had become familiar between them. "Martha said you wouldn't mind if I used the table to spread these out." Sadie moved closer, curious despite herself about what had captured his attention so completely. The papers appeared to be financial documents, bills, statements, legal notices that she recognized with a sinking heart as the accumulated debris of her impossible situation. "Martha brought these to me," Colt said, his voice carefully neutral. "Said you could use another set of eyes on the numbers." Heat rose in Sadie's cheeks at the thought of her private humiliation being laid bare before this man she barely knew, but she forced herself to remain calm. Martha meant well, and the truth was that Sadie had been avoiding these papers for weeks, unable to face the mathematical certainty of her failure. "I suppose there's no point in pretending the situation isn't what it is," she said, settling carefully into the chair across from him. "Though I'm not sure what you think you can do that I haven't already tried." Colt picked up a sheet of paper that she recognized as the bank's latest statement, his grey eyes moving across the columns of numbers with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was actually understanding what he was reading. "Mind me asking how the debt got so high?" Sadie sighed, the weight of the story settling over her like a familiar burden. "Thomas got sick 2 winters ago. Started with what we thought was just a bad cold, but it turned into pneumonia that wouldn't clear up. Doctor bills, hospital stays, specialists in billings, it all added up faster than we could keep track of. Then when he died, there were funeral expenses, legal fees, taxes we didn't know we owed." She gestured helplessly at the papers. "By the time I understood how bad things were, it was too late to catch up. The ranch wasn't making enough to cover the regular expenses, much less pay down debt." Colt nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that suggested he was thinking hard about something. "What's the ranch worth if you sold it outright?" "The bank appraised it at $45,000 last spring. But that was before the drought got so bad, before cattle prices dropped. Now," she shrugged, "maybe 35, 40 if we're lucky. And you owe 18,000 on the mortgage, plus penalties and accumulated interest. 22,000 by the time they're done with their calculations." Colt was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers with an intensity that made Sadie wonder what he was seeing that she'd missed. When he finally looked up, there was something in his expression that might have been hope if she'd been foolish. "Enough to believe in such things. What if you didn't have to sell?" he asked. Sadie felt a familiar stab of pain at the question that had haunted her dreams for months. "Then I'd find a way to keep it. But wishing doesn't change mathematics, Mr. Avery. I don't have $22,000 and I don't have any way to get it." "Maybe you do." The quiet confidence in his voice made her look at him more closely, noting the way his hands had stilled on the papers, the way his eyes had taken on the focused intensity she'd seen when he was working on a particularly challenging problem. "I don't understand." Colt reached for a pencil and turned over one of the bills, beginning to write numbers in the precise, angular handwriting of someone who'd learned to communicate clearly under pressure. "How many head of cattle did this place run at its peak?" "About 300, but we sold most of them to pay bills, and the drought killed off a lot of the rest. We're down to maybe 40 head now, and half of those are too old or too sick to be worth much." 300 head. Colt continued writing, his calculations marching across the paper in neat columns. "At current market prices, that's roughly $70,000 worth of livestock. Say you lose 10% to disease and accidents. You're still looking at 63,000 in gross revenue." Sadie felt a bitter laugh escape her. "Mr. Avery, I don't have the money to buy 300 head of cattle. I barely have enough to feed the ones I've got." "What if you didn't have to buy them?" The question hung in the air between them, like a challenge, and Sadie found herself leaning forward despite herself, caught by the quiet intensity in his voice. "Cattle ranches in the eastern part of the state are overstocked," Colt continued, his pencil moving steadily across the paper. "Drought's been worse there than here, and they're looking to move animals to better pasture. Some of them would be willing to board their cattle here for the winter in exchange for a percentage of the weight gain and breeding fees." The idea was so simple and so obvious that Sadie felt foolish for not thinking of it herself. "You think they'd trust their cattle to a failing ranch? They'd trust them to good pasture and competent management, which is what you'd be offering." Colt looked up from his calculations, his grey eyes steady on hers. "Question is whether you're willing to risk what you've got left on the chance of saving it all." Sadie pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her, and thought about the wedding ring that still circled her finger 3 months after anyone would have expected her to remove it. Thomas's ring, representing promises made and dreams shared, and a future that had been cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. "How much of a risk are we talking about?" she asked finally. If it works, you save the ranch and probably turn a profit. If it doesn't work, you lose what you were going to lose anyway, just a few months sooner. It was a gamble, pure and simple, but it was also the first real hope she'd had in months. And sitting across from her was a man who seemed to understand both the numbers and the risks involved. A man who spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced worse odds and somehow found a way through. "You'd help me set this up?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am, if you want me to." Sadie looked down at her hands, noting the way the morning light caught the gold band on her finger, and made her decision. Then, let's do it. October arrived with a cold snap that sent the cottonwoods along the creek into brilliant displays of gold and amber, their leaves dancing in the crisp morning breeze like nature's own celebration. The ranch had begun to show signs of the transformation that steady work and careful planning could accomplish. Fresh fence posts stood straight and true where sagging wire had once marked the boundaries. The barn gleamed with new paint, and the sound of cattle lowing in the pastures had returned. After months of silence, Colt's plan had worked better than Sadie had dared hope. 3 ranchers from the drought-stricken eastern counties had agreed to board their cattle at the Carver Ranch through the winter, bringing the total herd to just over 200 head. The animals were healthy and well-bred, their presence transforming the empty pastures into scenes of purposeful activity that reminded Sadie of the ranch's better days. But it was the change in Colt himself that surprised her most. The grim, silent man who'd stood on the auction platform 6 weeks ago had gradually given way to someone more complex, more present. He still carried his pain like a weight he couldn't set down, but there were moments now when she caught glimpses of the man he might have been before tragedy reshaped him. Those glimpses came most often in the evenings, when the day's work was done, and they found themselves sharing the front porch as the sun set over the valley. Martha had taken to retiring early, claiming exhaustion, but fooling no one with her transparent matchmaking efforts. Left alone, Sadie and Colt had gradually begun to talk, tentative conversations at first, but growing deeper as trust developed between them. It was during one of these evening conversations that Sadie first saw the letters. She'd gone inside to fetch a glass of water, her movements careful as the baby's weight shifted and pressed against her spine. When she returned to the porch, Colt was holding a bundle of envelopes tied with string, his expression distant as he stared at the return address visible on the top letter. "Sorry," he said, starting to put them away when he noticed her watching. "Didn't mean to bring personal business to your porch." "You don't have to apologize for having a life beyond this ranch," Sadie said gently, settling back into the rocking chair that had become her preferred spot for watching the sunset. "Though you don't have to share it either, if you'd rather not." Colt was quiet for a long moment, the letters balanced on his knee like a question he couldn't answer. In the golden light of evening, his face showed the weathering of a man who'd spent years outdoors, but also something softer, more vulnerable than he usually allowed others to see. "They're from Elena," he said finally. "My sister-in-law, my wife's sister." The simple statement carried layers of complexity that Sadie could only imagine. She waited, sensing that pushing for more would cause him to retreat behind the walls he'd built to protect himself from further pain. "She writes every month," Colt continued, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the evening breeze. "Started right after the funeral. News from home, family gossip, that sort of thing. I suppose she thinks it helps, does it?" Colt's laugh was bitter, devoid of any real humor. "Makes it harder to forget, if that's what you mean. Easier to remember what I lost." Sadie rocked gently, the chair creaking in the rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. "Maybe forgetting isn't the point. Maybe not." He turned the bundle of letters over in his hands, his fingers tracing the carefully written addresses. "Elena thinks I should come home, back to California. Says the family. Needs me that hiding out here isn't going to bring them back. Is that what you're doing? Hiding?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and for a moment Sadie thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd been asking himself the same question for too long. I don't know. Maybe. All I know is that being there, in the house where we lived, driving the same streets where it happened, it felt like drowning. Every corner held a memory. Every familiar place was a reminder of what I'd lost. Sadie thought about her own relationship with memory, how this ranch was filled with Thomas's presence in ways both comforting and heartbreaking. The rocking chair where he'd planned to sit with their children, the barn where he'd taught her to milk cows, the bedroom where he'd died, all of it woven together into a tapestry of love and loss that she couldn't escape, even if she'd wanted to. Sometimes the memories are all we have left, she said softly. Sometimes they're what keep the people we love alive in our hearts, and sometimes they're what keep us from living ourselves. The honesty in his voice surprised her, as did the way he was looking at her, not through her or past her, but directly at her, as if he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before. "You think I'm not living?" Sadie asked, one hand moving instinctively to her belly where the baby stirred restlessly. "I think you're trying to. But I also think you're scared to let go of the past enough to embrace the future." The observation stung because it carried more truth than she was comfortable acknowledging. She did wear Thomas's ring like a shield, did cling to routines and memories that kept him present in her daily life. But she was also building something new, wasn't she? Making plans for the baby, working to save the ranch, allowing herself to trust a stranger with her hopes and fears. "Is that what you think you're doing here?" she asked. "Embracing the future?" Colt was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of surprise, as if the realization was new to him. "Maybe I am. For the first time in 3 years, I'm thinking about what comes next instead of what I left behind." The admission created a moment of connection between them that felt both dangerous and necessary. Sadie found herself really looking at him, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands rested gently on the letters, the quiet strength that radiated from him even in moments of vulnerability. "The baby's coming soon," she said, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to state the obvious. "I know. Things will change then. The arrangement we have now, the routine we've built, all of that will be different." Colt nodded slowly, his grey eyes steady on hers. "Are you worried about that?" Sadie considered the question, recognizing the deeper currents beneath its simple surface. Was she worried about how a newborn would change the delicate balance they'd established? Or was she worried about something else entirely? About the way her heart had begun to skip when he smiled, about the sense of safety she felt when he was near, about the growing certainty that what she felt for this quiet, damaged man was more than gratitude or companionship. "I'm worried about a lot of things," she admitted finally, "but not about you being here when the baby comes. That's the one thing I'm not worried about." The smile that crossed Colt's face was small and tentative, but it transformed his entire expression, bringing light to eyes that had been dark for too long. "Good," he said simply, "because I'm not going anywhere." The first snow of the season came early, dusting the valley with a thin layer of white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Sadie stood at the kitchen window, watching Colt move through the morning routine of checking water troughs and breaking ice that had formed overnight. Even from a distance, she could see the confidence with which he moved among the cattle, the way the animals had learned to trust his presence and respond to his quiet commands. 8.5 months pregnant now, Sadie felt the full weight of her condition in every movement, every breath. The baby had dropped lower in recent days, a development that brought both relief from the pressure on her ribs and the growing certainty that birth was approaching fast. Dr. Morrison had warned her to stay close to town, but the ranch demanded attention that couldn't be postponed, and Colt couldn't manage everything alone, capable as he was. "You should be resting," Martha said, appearing at her elbow with a cup of tea and the disapproving expression she'd perfected over the past month. "Standing on your feet for hours isn't going to help that baby find its way into the world any easier." "The baby will come when it's ready," Sadie replied, accepting the tea gratefully. "And until then, there's work to be done." Through the window, she watched Colt pause in his work to examine something near the water tank, his posture shifting into the alert stillness that meant he'd found a problem requiring attention. Even after 2 months of working together, she was still learning to read his moods and expressions, still discovering the depths of knowledge and experience he carried beneath his quiet exterior. "He's a good man," Martha observed, following her gaze. "Better than I expected when you brought him home from that auction." "He is," Sadie agreed, though the simple words couldn't capture the complexity of what Colt had become to her. Partner in the ranch's recovery, certainly. Companion during the long evenings when loneliness might otherwise have overwhelmed her. But something more than that, too. Something she was only beginning to acknowledge, even to herself. "Question is," Martha continued with the directness that made her both beloved and occasionally infuriating, "what you plan to do about it." "About what?" "Don't play coy with me, Sadie May. I've seen the way you look at him, and more importantly, I've seen the way he looks at you. That man's falling in love, whether he admits it or not, and unless I'm much mistaken, so are you." Heat rose in Sadie's cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from the recognition that Martha was right. Over the past weeks, her feelings for Colt had evolved from gratitude to friendship to something deeper and more complicated than she'd been prepared to acknowledge. He was patient with her physical limitations, thoughtful about her comfort, and endlessly gentle in ways that made her heart ache with longing for things she'd thought buried with Thomas. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "Love never is, but that doesn't make it wrong." Before Sadie could respond, they heard the sound of boots on the front porch, followed by Colt's familiar knock. Martha went to answer the door, returning. Moments later with Colt in tow, his expression carrying the controlled urgency that meant serious trouble. "What is it?" Sadie asked, setting down her teacup and moving toward him with the awkward gait that pregnancy had imposed on her. "Storm coming in," Colt said, pulling off his gloves and reaching for the weather radio that had become a permanent fixture on the kitchen counter. "Big one, according to the forecast. Could dump 2 feet of snow before it's done, with winds up to 60 miles an hour. Sadie felt her stomach clench with more than just the baby's movement. A storm of that magnitude could be devastating to the cattle, especially the animals they were boarding for other ranches. If they lost significant numbers to weather, it would destroy not only her hopes of saving the ranch, but also her reputation and any chance of building the boarding business that represented their financial future. "How long do we have?" she asked. 12 hours, maybe 14 if we're lucky." Colt was already reaching for his coat, his movements efficient with the kind of practiced urgency that came from experience with emergencies. "I need to get the cattle moved to shelter and make sure we have enough feed stored where we can get to it, even if the snow drifts deep." "I'll help," Sadie said automatically, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were more hope than realistic assessment of her capabilities. "No, you won't," Colt said firmly, his grey eyes meeting hers with an intensity that brooked no argument. "You'll stay in the house where it's warm and safe, and you'll let me handle the outside work." "I can't just sit here while you—" "Yes, you can." The quiet authority in his voice reminded her suddenly of the military bearing that was never entirely absent from his manner. "I've handled worse situations than this with a lot less help. But I can't do what needs doing if I'm worried about you being out in weather that could put you and the baby at risk." The argument Sadie wanted to make died in her throat as she recognized the deeper concern beneath his practical words. He wasn't just protecting her from physical danger. He was protecting himself from the possibility of losing someone else he'd come to care about. "All right," she said softly, "but you check in every couple of hours. And if you run into trouble, you can't handle alone, you come get me regardless of the risk." Something flickered in Colt's expression, surprise perhaps, or gratitude, or maybe just recognition of the trust implied in her willingness to let him take charge. "I will," he promised. He was almost to the door when he paused, turning back, to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, might acknowledge the current of feeling that had been building between them for weeks. Instead, he simply touched the brim of his hat in the gesture that had become familiar between them. "Take care of yourself, Sadie May." Then he was gone, leaving her standing in the kitchen with Martha and the growing certainty that the storm, approaching from the north, was going to test more than just their ability to keep cattle alive. It was going to test the fragile bonds that had formed between two damaged people who'd found unexpected solace in each other's company. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Colt calling to the cattle, his voice carrying clearly on the cold air as he began the dangerous work of moving 200 head of animals to whatever shelter could be found. And deep in her belly, the baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing that the world was about to change in ways that none of them could predict or control. The storm hit with the fury of nature unleashed, transforming the familiar world outside into a howling wilderness of wind and snow. Sadie sat by the kitchen window, straining to catch glimpses of Colt through the white curtain that had descended over the valley, her anxiety growing with each hour that passed without word from him. The cattle had been moved to the sheltered areas behind the barn, but keeping them fed and watered in these conditions would require constant vigilance. Martha bustled around the kitchen, preparing hot meals that could be quickly reheated when Colt finally returned, her own worry manifesting in the kind of productive activity that kept hands busy and minds occupied. Neither woman spoke much, but their shared concern created a bond of understanding that needed no words. It was nearly midnight when they heard the sound of boots on the porch, followed by Colt's familiar knock. Martha rushed to open the door, ushering in a figure so covered with snow and ice that he was barely recognizable as human. His coat was frozen stiff, his mustache white with accumulated frost, and his movements carried the careful precision of a man fighting exhaustion. "Coffee," was all he said, and Martha immediately set about providing it while Sadie struggled to her feet, alarmed by the grey pallor of his skin and the way his hands shook as he tried to remove his gloves. "The cattle?" she asked. "Secure, fed and watered, with enough hay to last through tomorrow if the storm doesn't let up." He accepted the coffee Martha pressed into his hands, wrapping his fingers around the warm mug with obvious gratitude. "Lost. 2 head to the cold, but that's better than I expected given the conditions." The losses were significant but not catastrophic, and Sadie felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. 2 animals represented several $100s in potential income, but it was far less than the devastation that might have occurred without Colt's experience and quick action. "You need food and rest," Martha said firmly. "That storm's going to blow for another day at least, and you'll be no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Colt nodded wearily, but as he reached into his coat pocket to retrieve his gloves, several pieces of paper fell to the floor. Legal documents, Sadie realized, official-looking papers that had somehow survived the brutal conditions outside. One had landed face up, and she could see enough of the letterhead to recognize it as correspondence from a law firm in California. "Sorry," Colt said, moving to gather the papers, but not before Sadie had seen more than he'd probably intended. Her name caught her eye on one of the documents, along with terms like property transfer and beneficial ownership that made her heart skip with sudden understanding. "Colt," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of question that made him freeze in the act of collecting the scattered papers. "What are those?" For a long moment he remained crouched on the floor, the documents clutched in his hands, his expression cycling through resignation, guilt, and something that might have been relief. When he finally straightened, his grey eyes met hers with the kind of direct honesty that she'd learned to expect from him, even when the truth was difficult. "Legal papers?" he said simply. "Regarding this ranch." The simple statement hit Sadie, like a physical blow, though she couldn't yet understand why. "What about this ranch?" Colt set the papers on the kitchen table with careful precision, his movements deliberate as he arranged them in a neat stack. When he looked up, his expression carried the weight of a man who'd been carrying a secret that had grown too heavy to bear alone. "My name is Colt Alexander Avery," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. 3 years ago, I owned the second largest cattle ranch in Sonoma County, California. 15,000 acres, prize-winning, livestock, a house that had been in my family for 4 generations. Sadie felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words began to register. Martha had gone very still, her face pale, with the same dawning understanding that was making Sadie's world tilt on its axis. "After the accident," Colt continued, "after I lost Mary and Sarah, I couldn't bear to stay there. Every fence post, every building, every piece of ground reminded me of what I'd destroyed. So I gave it all away." "Gave it away." Sadie's voice was barely a whisper. "To various charities, mostly. Some to family members who needed help. I kept just enough to live on, and I walked away from everything else." He gestured toward the papers. "These documents represent the final transfer of my remaining assets to a trust fund, established for the benefit of struggling ranch families." The room seemed to spin around Sadie as she tried to process what she was hearing. The quiet, desperate man she'd hired for $50 a month had been one of the wealthiest ranchers in California. The man who'd stood on the auction block selling his labor for room and board had voluntarily given away a fortune that most people could only dream of. "You lied to me," she said, though the words came out more confused than angry. "I didn't lie about who I am," Colt replied carefully. "I am exactly the man you met at that auction, someone who'd lost everything that mattered and was trying to find a reason to keep going. The money, the property, the reputation, none of that was who I was anymore." "But you could have saved the ranch yourself," Sadie said, the full scope of the deception beginning to dawn on her. "You could have paid off the debt, restored everything, made this place profitable again. Instead, you let me struggle, let me worry, let me think I might lose everything, because it wouldn't have been yours anymore." Colt interrupted, his voice carrying a passion that surprised her. "It would have been mine, or the bank's, or some strangers who bought it at auction, but it wouldn't have been the place where your husband lived and worked and dreamed. It wouldn't have been your children's inheritance." Sadie stared at him, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with this revelation of hidden wealth and deliberate deception. "So, what are these papers? What does this trust fund have to do with my ranch?" Colt reached for the top document, unfolding it with hands that trembled slightly. "The Carver Ranch has been designated as the first beneficiary of the fund, which means that as of yesterday, when these papers were filed, your mortgage has been paid in full. The ranch is yours, free and clear, along with enough operating capital to ensure its success for years to come." The silence that followed was so complete that Sadie could hear the wind howling outside, the creak of the house settling, the steady tick of the clock on the kitchen wall. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "You had no right," she whispered finally, tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said whether they were from gratitude or betrayal, or some combination of both. "You had no right to make that decision for me. I know. I wanted to save it myself. I needed to save it myself. I know that too." Sadie pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the baby's active response to her elevated heart rate, and tried to make sense of emotions that seemed to be pulling her in a dozen different directions at once. Relief that the ranch was safe, anger at being deceived, gratitude for the gesture, and underneath it all, a growing certainty that everything between them had changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why give up everything you had, then turn around and give even more to a stranger?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he was memorizing every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me a reason to care about tomorrow, and because—" He paused, seeming to gather courage for words. "That cost him dearly. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped being a stranger. You became the most important thing in my world." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross, while outside the storm raged on, transforming the familiar world into something new and uncertain and full of possibilities that neither of them had dared to imagine. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world transformed by 2 feet of pristine snow that caught the early sunlight and threw it back in dazzling displays of crystal and gold. But inside the ranch house, the atmosphere remained charged with the emotional aftermath of Colt's revelation, and tension that seemed to press against the walls like something alive and restless. Sadie had barely slept, her mind churning through the implications of what she'd learned. The ranch was safe. More than safe, it was now positioned for a prosperity she'd never dared imagine. But the foundation of trust she'd built with Colt felt shaken, transformed by the knowledge that he'd been operating from a position of hidden strength rather than shared vulnerability. She found him in the barn at dawn, moving among the cattle, with the same quiet competence he'd shown every day since arriving. But there was something different in his posture now, a wariness that suggested he was bracing himself for whatever consequences his honesty might bring. The animals pressed close around him, seeking the warmth and reassurance that his presence provided, and Sadie felt a stab of recognition at how naturally he'd assumed the role of protector and provider. "How are the losses?" she asked, stepping carefully through the snow that had drifted into the barn through gaps in the siding. "Better than expected," Colt replied without looking up from the water trough he was checking for ice. "The 2 we lost were older animals that probably wouldn't have made it through winter anyway. The rest came through in good shape." The practical conversation felt strange given the emotional upheaval of the previous night, but Sadie sensed that both of them needed the familiarity of routine while they processed the new reality between them. Work had always been their common ground, the place where they understood each other without need for explanation. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said finally, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "About the trust fund, about your reasons for setting it up." Colt's hand stilled on the water trough, but he didn't turn around. "And I understand why you did it. I even understand why you didn't tell me. But I need you to understand what this means for me, for us." Now he did turn, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "What does it mean?" Sadie moved closer, close enough to see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there before his confession. "It means I don't know what's real anymore. The man I hired, the partnership we built, the feelings that developed between us, how much of that was genuine, and how much was you playing some kind of elaborate game of charity?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she needed to say them, needed to voice the doubts that had been eating at her since the moment she'd seen those legal documents. "None of it was charity," Colt said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that cut through her confusion like sunlight through storm clouds. "Every day I've worked here, every conversation we've shared, every moment of connection between us, that was real. The money doesn't change that, doesn't it? You could have bought this place 10 times over. You could have hired the best ranch, heads in Montana, brought in experts to restore everything, turned this into the showcase it used to be. Instead, you chose to work alongside a desperate pregnant widow, watching her struggle with problems you could have solved with a single phone call. Colt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the snow-covered pastures where cattle were beginning to emerge from their shelters, testing the new landscape with cautious steps. When he finally spoke, his voice carried depths of pain that she was only beginning to understand. After the accident, after I lost Mary and Sarah, I thought about ending it all, not just the ranch, not just the money, everything. I couldn't see the point of going on in a world where the people I loved most were gone because of my mistakes. The admission hit Sadie like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the magnitude of the anguish he'd been carrying. She'd known he was haunted by his losses, but she hadn't fully grasped the depths of his despair or how close he'd come to giving up entirely. "What stopped you?" she asked softly. "Time, mostly, and the gradual realization that destroying myself wouldn't bring them back or make amends for what I'd done. But I also couldn't figure out how to live with the guilt of having so much when my carelessness had cost them everything." He turned back to her, his expression raw with honesty. "The trust fund wasn't about charity. It was about trying to find a way to make my continued existence mean something." Sadie felt tears prick at her eyes as she began to understand the true scope of what he'd been offering her. Not just financial salvation, but a chance for both of them to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their separate tragedies. "And then you found me," she said, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in her mind. "I found a woman who was fighting to preserve something precious against impossible odds. Someone who reminded me that there are things in this world worth saving, worth fighting for." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Someone who made me remember what it felt like to hope." Before Sadie could respond, they heard the sound of an automobile engine outside, followed by car doors slamming and urgent voices calling her name. Through the barn door, she could see Martha hurrying across the yard toward a black sedan that had somehow made it through the snow-blocked roads. "Mrs. Carver!" called a voice she recognized as belonging to Dr. Morrison. "We need to talk!" Colt moved immediately to her side, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture of support that had become natural between them. Together, they made their way out of the barn toward the group of people who had gathered near the house. Dr. Morrison stood beside his car, his expression grave, while behind him emerged a man in an expensive overcoat who carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested official business. Martha was wringing her hands, her face pale with worry as she hurried toward them. "Doctor!" Sadie called out, her heart beginning to race with sudden fear. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" "The baby's fine, as far as I know," Dr. Morrison replied, his voice carrying a tension that made Sadie's stomach clench with apprehension. "But we have a situation that requires immediate attention." The man in the overcoat stepped forward, revealing a badge pinned to his lapel that identified him as some kind of federal agent. "Mrs. Carver, my name is Agent Harrison with the Department of Agriculture. I'm afraid we have a problem with your cattle operation." Sadie felt Colt tense beside her, his entire body shifting into the alert readiness she'd seen when he sensed danger. "What kind of problem?" Agent Harrison consulted a folder he carried, his expression professionally neutral but somehow ominous. "We've received reports of diseased animals on your property. Specifically, cases of what appears to be foot and mouth disease among the cattle you're boarding for other ranchers." The words hit Sadie like a sledgehammer, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her momentarily speechless. Foot and mouth disease was every rancher's nightmare, highly contagious, economically devastating, and requiring the immediate quarantine and potential destruction of every animal on the property. "That's impossible," Colt said flatly, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who knew livestock disease when he saw it. "I've been working with these animals every day. There's no sign of foot and mouth or any other communicable disease." "Nevertheless," Agent Harrison continued, "we are required to implement immediate quarantine procedures. No animals can leave this property and all cattle will need to be examined by federal veterinarians within the next 48 hours. Sadie felt the world tilt around her as the implications became clear. Even if the cattle proved healthy, the quarantine would destroy the boarding agreements that represented the ranch's financial future. Ranchers who had trusted her with their animals would be ruined if their cattle were infected or destroyed, and her reputation would be finished before it had properly begun. "Who made the report?" she asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. Agent Harrison consulted his folder again, his expression giving nothing away. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the source of the complaint, but I can tell you that it came from someone with detailed knowledge of your operation and the animals involved." As the federal agent spoke, Sadie became aware of a familiar burning sensation low in her back, a tightening across her belly that she'd been ignoring in the stress of the moment. But now the sensations were becoming impossible to dismiss, accompanied by a pressure that seemed to be building with each passing minute. She looked up at Colt, seeing her own understanding reflected in his worried eyes. The baby was coming, and it was coming now, just as their carefully rebuilt world threatened to collapse around them once again. "Doctor," she said quietly, her hand moving to her belly as another contraction gripped her, "I think you're going to be needed for more than just cattle disease today." The next few hours blurred together in a chaos of competing emergencies that tested everyone's ability to maintain focus under pressure. Dr. Morrison had immediately taken charge of Sadie's situation, guiding her into the house while issuing rapid-fire instructions to Martha about preparations for an unexpected home birth. The contractions were coming fast and strong, suggesting that the baby had decided to make its appearance with the same urgency that seemed to characterize everything else happening that day. Meanwhile, Agent Harrison had established a command post in the barn, coordinating with federal veterinarians who were somehow managing to reach the ranch, despite roads that were still largely impassable from the storm. Colt moved between the two crises with the kind of calm efficiency that spoke of experience, with situations where multiple life-and-death decisions had to be made simultaneously. "How far apart are the contractions?" Dr. Morrison asked, checking his watch as Sadie gripped the edge of the kitchen table and breathed through another wave of pain. 3 minutes, Martha replied, her voice steady despite the worry lines that had deepened around her eyes. "Been that way for the last hour. Then we are committed to doing this here. Even if the roads were clear, there's no time to get her to the hospital." Dr. Morrison turned to Colt, who had just entered the kitchen with snow still clinging to his boots. "I need you to help move her upstairs. This baby's coming whether we're ready or not." Colt moved immediately to Sadie's side, his strong hands gentle as he helped her navigate the stairs that had become a significant challenge in her condition. "Easy does it," he murmured, his voice carrying the same calm reassurance he used with frightened animals. "One step at a time." In the bedroom that had once been hers and Thomas's, Martha had already begun preparing for the birth with the kind of practical efficiency that came from a lifetime of dealing with emergencies. Clean sheets, hot water, towels, and medical supplies were arranged with military precision, transforming the familiar space into something that looked almost like a field hospital. "The federal veterinarians are starting their examination of the cattle," Colt reported, as he helped Sadie settle onto the bed. "They'll work through the night if necessary to get answers about the disease report." Another contraction gripped Sadie, stronger than the previous ones, and she found herself reaching instinctively for Colt's hand. His fingers intertwined with hers immediately, providing an anchor of strength and stability in the midst of overwhelming physical sensation. "Who would have reported us?" she gasped as the contraction subsided. "Who would have known enough about our operation to make a credible complaint?" Colt's expression darkened with the kind of controlled anger that suggested he had suspicions, but no proof. "Someone who's been watching us closely enough to know about the boarding agreements and the cattle we've taken in. Someone who wanted to cause maximum damage to our reputation and financial prospects." Before Sadie could respond, another contraction hit with the force of a freight train, and all other concerns faded into insignificance compared to the immediate reality of bringing new life into the world. Dr. Morrison moved with practiced efficiency, checking her progress and issuing quiet instructions to Martha about preparations for the delivery. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the federal investigation, vehicles arriving, people calling to each other, the occasional lowing of cattle being moved and examined. The contrast between the intimate, life-affirming drama taking place in the bedroom and the potentially devastating crisis unfolding in the barn created a surreal atmosphere that felt like something from a fever dream. "I can see the head," Dr. Morrison announced, his voice carrying the excitement that came with witnessing the miracle of birth. "A couple more pushes should do it." Sadie felt a surge of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own reserves, as if the combined hopes and prayers of everyone who cared about her and the ranch were lending her the power she needed. Colt's hand in hers was warm and solid, his quiet presence a reminder that she wasn't facing this challenge alone. "Thomas's firefighting equipment," she said suddenly, the thought coming to her with startling clarity despite the intensity of the moment. "In the barn loft. If someone's trying to sabotage us, they might try to destroy evidence by starting a fire." Colt's grip on her hand tightened, and she could see understanding flash in his eyes. Thomas had been a volunteer firefighter, and his equipment was still stored in the barn, along with emergency supplies that could be crucial if someone decided to escalate their attack on the ranch. "I'll check on it," as soon as he began, but was interrupted by Dr. Morrison's urgent call for one final push. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, as Sadie drew on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, and suddenly the room was filled with the thin, piercing cry of a newborn baby taking its first breath in the Montana air. "It's a girl," Dr. Morrison announced, his voice warm with the satisfaction of a successful delivery. "And she's beautiful." Through tears of exhaustion and overwhelming joy, Sadie looked up at Colt and saw her own wonder reflected in his storm-gray eyes. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever threats they might face, this moment of pure triumph belonged to them completely. The baby's first cry echoed through the farmhouse like a declaration of hope, cutting through the tension that had gripped everyone for hours. Sadie held her daughter for the first time, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers and the way the infant's eyes seemed to focus on her face with startling intensity. After months of anticipation and worry, the reality of holding this new life in her arms felt almost too overwhelming to process. "She's perfect," Martha whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she gazed at the newest member of their unconventional family. "Absolutely perfect." Dr. Morrison completed his examination with the satisfaction of a man who had overseen hundreds of births, but never lost his sense of wonder at the miracle of new life. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, and healthy as a horse. She's going to be a strong one, just like her mother. Colt stood at the edge of the room, his expression cycling through awe, protective tenderness, and something deeper that Sadie was only beginning to recognize. When their eyes met, she saw in his face the same transformation she felt in her own heart, the sudden, overwhelming certainty that everything had changed, that this tiny person had somehow made them into a family in ways that went beyond logic or convention. But their moment of peace was shattered by urgent shouts from outside, followed by the acrid smell of smoke that sent alarm racing through everyone in the room. "Fire!" someone yelled from the yard, and through the bedroom window they could see the orange glow that meant serious trouble. Colt was moving before anyone else had fully processed the danger, his military training taking over as he assessed the situation. With tactical precision, "The barn," he said, his voice grim with understanding. "Someone set fire to the barn." The implications hit Sadie like a physical blow. Not only were the cattle sheltered in and around the barn, but Thomas's firefighting equipment was stored in the loft, along with hay and feed that would burn like tinder once the flames took hold. If they lost the barn, they would lose most. Of the cattle, their winter feed supply, and potentially the ranch buildings as well if the fire spread. You have to save them, Sadie said, though the words came out more as a plea than a command. The cattle, the equipment, everything. I will, Colt replied, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that made her believe him despite the overwhelming odds. But I need you to stay here with the baby. Keep her safe, no matter what happens. He moved to the bed, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to Sadie's forehead, and then, with infinite tenderness, to the baby's tiny head. I love you both, he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of a man who understood he might not get another chance to say them. Then he was gone, his footsteps pounding down the stairs and out into the night, where the fire was already beginning to light up the sky with hellish intensity. From the bedroom window, Sadie watched Colt race toward the barn with the kind of purposeful determination that spoke of a man who had faced life-and-death situations before and knew how to function under extreme pressure. The federal agents and veterinarians who had been examining the cattle were now working frantically to move the animals away from the burning building, but it was clear that the fire was spreading faster than they could evacuate the livestock. That's when Colt disappeared into the barn itself, heading for the ladder that led to the loft where Thomas's firefighting equipment was stored. Sadie's heart stopped as she realized what he was planning: to retrieve the equipment that might give them a chance to control the blaze, even if it meant risking his life in a building that was already beginning to fill with smoke and flame. He's going for the equipment, Martha said, her voice tight with fear as she watched from beside the window. That fool man is going to get himself killed trying to save this place. But Sadie understood what Colt was doing and why. This wasn't just about saving the barn or the cattle or even the ranch itself. It was about proving that some things were worth fighting for, that love and loyalty and the bonds between people could triumph over the forces that sought to destroy them. Minutes passed like hours as they watched the drama unfold outside. The fire continued to spread, but it was also being met with organized resistance as Colt emerged from the barn carrying Thomas's equipment and began coordinating the firefighting efforts with the kind of natural authority that made others instinctively follow his lead. And then, gradually, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The flames that had seemed unstoppable were being contained, then pushed back, then finally extinguished as Colt and the other men worked through the night with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that everything they cared about hung in the balance. When dawn finally broke over the valley, the barn was damaged but standing, the cattle were safe, and Colt Avery stood in the yard covered with soot and exhaustion, but very much alive. "He did it," Sadie whispered, looking down at her sleeping daughter and then back out at the man who had risked everything to protect what they'd built together. He actually did it. 6 months later, spring had returned to Willow Ridge Valley, with the kind of abundant beauty that made the hardships of winter seem like distant memories. The ranch showed the evidence of a harsh season survived and overcome. New fence posts replacing those damaged by storms, a rebuilt section of barn where the fire had left its mark, and pastures that were already beginning to green with the promise of another productive year. Sadie stood on the front porch, baby Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms, watching Colt work with a group of young men who had come to learn ranching techniques from someone whose reputation had spread throughout the state. The cattle boarding business had not only recovered from the crisis of the false disease report, which had been traced to a disgruntled competitor and resulted in federal charges, but had expanded beyond anything she'd originally imagined. The morning was warm enough that she'd left the screen door open, letting the sound of Rose's contented breathing mingle with the familiar ranch sounds that had become the soundtrack of their new life. Martha emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling into the rocking chair that had been Thomas's final gift to their family. "That man of yours is building quite a reputation," Martha observed, nodding toward the group gathered around Colt as he demonstrated proper cattle handling techniques. "Had 3 more ranchers call this week wanting to send their sons here to learn the business," Sadie smiled, watching Colt's patient instruction of the young men who hung on his every word. His natural teaching ability had become apparent shortly. After the fire, when word had spread about how he'd managed to save both livestock and buildings through a combination of quick thinking and practical knowledge. Now the Carver Ranch was becoming known as a place where the next generation of cattlemen could learn not just the technical aspects of ranching, but the deeper values of stewardship and responsibility that made the difference between a job and a calling. He's good with them, Sadie agreed, noting how the young men responded to Colt's quiet authority and genuine interest in their success. Reminds me of how Thomas used to work with the seasonal hands, always taking time to explain the why behind the how. The comparison no longer brought the sharp stab of pain it once had. Thomas would always be part of the foundation of her life, the bedrock of love and memory upon which everything else was built. But she had learned that honoring his memory didn't require closing her heart to new love, especially when that love came in the form of a man who understood and respected what had come before. Rose stirred in her arms, making the soft sounds. That meant she was beginning to wake from her nap. At 6 months old, she was already showing signs of the strong will and bright intelligence that seemed to run in the Carver family, along with the steady temperament that Sadie liked to think came from Colt's influence on their daily lives. "Speaking of that man of yours," Martha said, with the knowing smile that had become familiar over the past months, "have you two set a date yet?" The question brought warmth to Sadie's cheeks, though she was no longer surprised by Martha's direct approach to subjects that others might consider delicate. The engagement had been proposed and accepted 3 months ago, in the quiet of an evening much like this one, with words that were simple and heartfelt rather than elaborate or dramatic. "October," Sadie replied, shifting Rose to her shoulder, as the baby began to show signs of being ready for another feeding. "We thought it would be fitting to have the ceremony on the anniversary of when we first met." "A year since the auction," Martha mused, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had watched a plan come together exactly as hoped. Hard to believe so much has changed in such a short time. It was hard to believe, Sadie reflected, looking out over the thriving ranch and the man who had become the center of her new world. A year ago, she had been a desperate widow, facing the loss of everything she held dear. Now, she was part of a family that had grown organically from shared work, mutual respect, and the kind of love that developed gradually but proved to be unshakable once established. Colt looked up from his instruction, catching her eye across the yard, and the smile that passed between them carried the weight of everything they had built together. He raised a hand in greeting, and she waved back, noting how the young men around him followed his gaze with the kind of respectful interest that suggested they recognized something special when they saw it. "He's coming this way," Martha observed, gathering up the coffee cups with the efficient movements of someone preparing to make herself scarce. "I'll just go start dinner preparations." Colt approached the porch with the easy stride of a man completely comfortable in his surroundings, his boots clean despite the morning's work, his shirt rolled up at the sleeves to reveal the strong forearms that had built so much of what they now enjoyed. He paused at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Sadie and Rose with an expression that never failed to make her heart skip. "How are my girls?" he asked, the possessive warmth in his voice still new enough to surprise her with its intensity. "Perfect," Sadie replied, and meant it. Absolutely perfect. Behind them, a new family portrait sat on the mantel. Sadie and Colt and baby Rose, captured in one of those moments of genuine happiness that photographers sometimes manage to freeze in time. It stood beside the older photographs that chronicled the ranch's history, not replacing what had come before, but adding to it, creating a visual record of how love could grow and change and find new expressions without diminishing what had existed previously. As Colt climbed the steps to join them, steps 2, Sadie looked out over the valley that had become their shared home. and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they had built something lasting and worthwhile from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities they were only beginning to explore, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next.